Welcome to CMO Confidential, the podcast that takes you inside the drama, decisions, and choices that go with being the head of marketing. Hosted by five-time CMO Mike Linton.
Welcome, marketers, advertisers, and those who love them to Marketing Confidential. CMO Confidential is a program that takes you inside the drama, the decisions, and the politics that go with being the head of marketing at any company in what is one of the most scrutinized positions in the executive suite. I'm Mike Linton, the former CMO of Best Buy, eBay, Farmers Insurance, and Ancestry.com, here with my guest today, Kip Knight. Full disclosure, Kip and I started at P&G in brand management back in the Pleistocene era, and this is his second time on the show. Welcome back, Kip.
Mike, a pleasure to be here.
Kip has had a number of roles in a variety of companies. Among them, he was the CMO of Taco Bell, the president of H&R Block's retail business, and he's also the founder of CMO Coaches, which he currently oversees. He's also a twice published author, having penned Learn to Leap and Crafting Persuasion. Now, today we're going to try something a little different and switch things up a bit. We're going to have a discussion about marketing and finance, with the topic being why CMOs should learn to speak finance, the universal language of business. Kip is going to lead this discussion, as this is a class I teach at Kip's CMO Bootcamp. So Kip, the microphone is yours. Let's get started and see how this new format works.
Well, thanks, Mike. And like I've told you before, I think you've had so much experience on this topic that I would like to have a little bit of a tennis match and go back and forth, and we can ask each other some questions on this. But the starting point that I'd like to make is that, and we've said this on some previous podcasts, CMOs have the shortest tenure of any of the C roles out there. For perspective, it's about 18 months, the median for a CMO. CFOs are 5 years, CEOs are 7 years. And the primary reason CMOs get fired is because they have a lack of alignment between themselves and the CEO. Now, the odds are very, very strong that your CEO is a former CFO. And marketers better learn the language of finance, because CFOs do not have to learn the language of marketing. And that's the theme of today's discussion. And what I'd like to do is to maybe throw it back to you, Mike, and talk about some of the challenges you've seen for marketers that don't really understand the language of finance, and just jump right into what are some of the proactive ways that you think marketers can make sure they don't fall into this trap.
So first I will say the universal language of business is finance. It's not marketing. It's not anything else. And when you think about your investors or your board or Wall Street or anyone else, whether it's private equity, VC, or public companies, the universal language that everyone understands is finance. And the leader of that communication to the street and to the investors is always the CFO. The CEO has a role to play, but the CFO is the driver of all those communications. So one of the things I would encourage marketers to do is understand that language and translate for the CFO. Because that to me is super important, and actually it's what investors and people care about the most is those kind of results. So I always encourage people to think like a CFO and help the CFO do his or her job, because his or her job is not really to do anything with marketing other than coordinate it and then forecast sales and profit.
Hey, Mike, let me jump into that a little bit and we understand the CFO. I mean, one thing that kind of amazes me is marketers is supposed to be really good at understanding other targets and how they're thinking and feeling. And yet I'm not sure a lot of marketers can envision walking a mile in a CFO shoes. And I think it might be worth just kind of comparing and contrasting what a CFO's got to deal with compared to a CMO. Because I agree with you. I think step one is just understanding where are they coming from. And to get started on that, maybe we can think about, your typical CFO has gone up through a fairly traditional, non-changing curriculum during their career. Whereas CMOs, I call it choose your own adventure. I mean, I don't think I've met a CMO that has had the same career path as anybody else. They all are very different. And so when they actually get to the top spot for finance and for marketing, just making sure they understand the roles of each other and the dependencies of each other is where some of the miscommunication can start. So you got any thoughts on that?
I do. And I think the burden on this is really on the CMO more than the CFO.
Absolutely.
And I also think, look, you and I probably benefited from having general manager roles in our career where suddenly if you realize, gosh, a whole bunch of people are going to get paid on how much money I make the company, and I'm going to be evaluated off this, you have a tendency to think a lot more like a CFO than just a pure marketer. Mm-hmm. But and so my thing about walking in the shoes of the CFO is think what the CFO has to do. And you call them stations of the cross, but they have to do all the forecasting for the company. They have to keep track of everything. They are by nature always wanting to have spare profit and sales running around.
Right.
Because the last thing they want to do, and they're usually the mouthpiece to the street, I mean Wall Street or the investors. And they're the first line of explanation as to why things are going badly. They also have audit, and they also are involved in mergers and acquisitions and tax and payments and everything else. So the idea that they're going to be deeply, deeply involved in marketing in anything but it being a line item that they have to report on is probably a bit of a reach unless they are a super CFO, which if you get one of those, you're lucky. So I think one of the things I would be thinking about as a CMO is how can I help the CFO do his or her job? And a lot of that is by translating marketing into things that the CFO's target market can understand. And what the target market doesn't care about is a lot of the numbers that the marketer does care about, like brand awareness, consideration, all kinds of tracking like this. They care mostly about sales and profit. And so I'd encourage CMOs to think that way and have a marketplace scorecard that shows that.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't want to stereotype too much, but in almost every company I can think of, if you were having the CFO come up from central casting, and the director was telling them, "Well, what's my personality?" It's going to be, some would say a pessimist, some would say a realist, but it's certainly not an optimist. I don't think I've ever met an optimistic CFO simply because they have to be a pessimist. They have to always be thinking about the downside. And yet marketers, and I think that's just the nature of the beast, we've got to be optimistic because who's going to want to follow a marketer that, is like, well, we're probably not going to do it this year, but,
Here's my thing. Marketing is the offense of the company.
Yes.
But so you have to be optimistic and you have to be willing to take some risks. But you have to understand the CFO, it's not an asymmetrical thing for the CFO. A downslide is much worse than an upside.
Absolutely.
And so if you're the CFO, explain to your investors why the stock is getting hammered or why you're going to reduce the dividend or why you're missing sales is a lot less. It hurts a lot more than saying, well, we beat our sales goal by an extra 3%.
Right.
So by definition, they are managing, at least in my mind, an asymmetrical risk because, and let's face it, if you beat the plan by 3% or 5% or 7%, you don't get proportionally more kudos. You do get punished more for missing the plan. So by definition, you have an offensive player or mindset in the marketer and a by definition, kind of a little more defensive player in the CFO, and that's by design.
Absolutely. And if going back to your point about communicating and aligning with the CFO, where marketers get in trouble is they skip that part, and it's all upside, and it's all going to be great, and don't worry about anything. We got this, and all. And that's why marketers, frankly, I think have a bit of a credibility issue because they're always talking about the upside. You would have a heck of a lot more credibility with your CFO, your CEO, and the board if you took, frankly, a lot of their concerns into consideration for everything that you're talking about. So you've got more of a balanced assessment. You have to be the optimist. You have to be the one holding the candle in the darkness. But if you're all Pollyannish and you're not acknowledging what they're telling you, that is where a lot of, I think, CFOs and CEOs start to think, I'm not sure this person gets it. And I'm not sure I want them on my team if they're going to be that naive as to what we're up against.
Well, here's where I draw the line. There's a big difference between a promise and a trend.
Yeah.
I don't make promises if they're not coming off of a trend.
Right.
And one of the things is a trend I can project, and a CFO can project that trend with me.
Right.
A promise is a bet that a defensive-minded player shouldn't want to take. And so my thing is, when I am talking to boards and I'm working with my CFOs, I'm thinking, I'm going to talk about the trend, and then I can project that trend out, and then maybe I can alter the angle of that trend. But I'm probably not going to do that unless I have math that is changing the trend. But I'm not going to ask the company to bet a lot on a promise. I have to have either test results that say that promise is a worthy bet,
right,
or a trend line that says, yes, if I feed this trend line, it will grow. And I think where a lot of marketers get hung up, and surely early in my career, I had this happen to me, is I see the opportunity and I'll make the promise, but I won't understand what it's like to miss that promise from the CFO seat.
Right.
And I also, if you're the CFO and you allow promises to come in from every function, what you have is an awful lot of promises and no real trend.
Right.
And that's where, as a CFO, your job is to not let a bunch of promises hang out.
And credibility and political capital with your board is the most precious asset that a CEO has. And once they've spent that, then they're going to start wondering about their own job security, because the next time they come back and give an update to the board member can't help but think in the back of their mind, wait a minute, didn't you say last time? And look what happened.
Well, let's say, what's the company really trying to do? It's got all this money, and it's going to spend that money, and in turn, it's supposed to produce better sales and better profit. The marketer, at least in a lot of the jobs that you and I have been in, has a big portion of that money. The obligation to spend that money in a way the company gets what it wants, which is sales, profits, and stability over time. That's sales overnight, brand over time kind of thing, is why they give you the money. And they don't give you the money to make a bunch of bets that may or may not pay off. They give you the money because they expect that to happen.
Right.
Communicating in that kind of fashion to your CFO and then to your board and your CEO, I think, is super important. And also, why they give you the money. And I don't expect a lot of, one of the things I advise CMOs to think of is you don't want a lot of kudos from your board or your CFO or CEO. The biggest kudo they can give you is give you the money and let you do what you think is right with it.
Right. Right. Well, Mike, a lot of what you're talking about is you're assuming a strong partnership with your CFO. So let's talk a little bit about how you've created some of those partnerships in the past. One thing I can tell you is I think the role of educating the CFO privately before you get in the middle of a crisis is absolutely important, because if it's really getting ugly, people are going to tend to go back into their silo and really go focus solely on what their job is. Well, why don't you talk about some of the ways in which you've had strong relationships with CFOs and how that paid off for you?
Yeah, a couple of things I would say. First, I guess it makes sense to talk about the marketing CFO first, and then the relationship with the CFO of the company second, if that works for you.
Yeah, I love this. Okay.
So I have, starting when I went to Best Buy, I created a job called the marketing CFO, which is someone from the finance group and usually a staff underneath that person that sits on the marketing team. And their job is to coordinate all the money and to make sure that the team is measuring that even-handedly and fairly. I don't want each function measuring its own stuff and saying how great it is. The job of all those functions, and marketing is the least homogeneous function in the company, is to produce the best ROI possible for the company today and tomorrow, and to strike the right balance between today and tomorrow. The marketing CFO's job is to watch that money, help measure that money in terms of how it's doing, keep a foot in the CFO of the company's camp so they know what's happening, and they're explaining the measures, but also bring back the pressures on the CFO and the company financials back to the marketing team. So I'll have the marketing CFO will come in and say, look, 2 quarters out, we're looking, it's going to be tougher. we're going to want to be thinking of more sales here, or we're going to have extra money potentially here. Think about how you want to spend it, because you don't want to be whipsawing you don't want the company financials whipsawing the marketing department because the timings are wrong. So I've always had a marketing CFO do that. And by the way, that is a super cool job, because you get to see just about every single thing in marketing, a lot of contracts, sometimes sponsorship deals and all kinds of things. And you're right in the middle of a lot of strategy and consumer stuff. So that's the marketing CFO. I think then I always want a relationship personally for me and as many of my lead team as I can with the CFO. And I want to understand what the CFO is seeing. And then we want to have a meeting of the minds on what I'm trying to do and what he or she is trying to do. And so that we are bonded together on it. And when we take a big risk, one of those offensive risks I talked about, we are in it together versus I take the risk and then I call up the CFO and go, hey, I took this big risk and I just lost a lot of money. And I really want you to tell the board about that. And I can give you some good stories about that if you like. So,
well, let me ask, we'll come back to that one, but the two tricks out of your playbook, well, tricks is probably not the right word, two tested techniques out of your playbook.
Tricks, Kip, they're not, yes. Hard.
Number one, I know that you always work with the CFO to hold something back so that when the inevitable phone call comes, hey, Mike, we got to cut the budget, you're not in as much trouble as if you spend every nickel. And the other is your testing pipeline. So why don't you talk briefly about those two techniques? Because you can use those two techniques whether or not your organization can afford a marketing CFO.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. The first, I call it brand available. I think it's lifted right out of our Proctor days, which is I'll try and have 2% of the money that we are sitting on and not allocated. Because if you give marketers all this money, what they would do is they will allocate every single cent and plan for perfection. And then what happens is partway through the first quarter, usually, or Q2, somebody goes, oh my God, we're not going to make the numbers. Everyone has to return like X% of the budget. Right. Now we have to go back and rip apart every perfectly planned marketing thing. No, the brand available is sitting there in case that happens. So I don't have to mess up the marketing planning. If we are beating our numbers, that 2% becomes available for the best new idea.
Right.
And that 2% is in addition to our basic testing pipeline. It's standalone money that we're going to use as a buffer. And it's super hard to get this established the first time you do it because everyone wants to take that 2%, but once you establish it, it really works. And then the second thing I try and build in all the time is what I'm going to call a 4-box grid. Long-term tools we know that we are funding. Short-term tools we know, like performance marketing, that we are funding. And then long-term tools that we are testing and short-term tools that we are testing. And I'll have that 4-box grid. And on the right side of that testing grid, we'll try and test as many things as possible with the least amount of money and time to prove that they work, so we can put them into next year's plan. Back to if I have a trend line that I've proved in testing, I can bring it into next year's plan and get funding for it. If I don't have
my reality check, I'll give you my percentage, but of all the things you tested, what percentage actually made it out of the test and you expanded?
Oh gosh, maybe, I think you probably have to test. I think it's maybe 10 to 20%, maybe 25% of the things that make it out of test. But also, I think the thing is the team really testing real things or not? And I will break out the general A/B testing. You can run that forever, and that's not a special thing. Right. Real testing would be like, we're going to test a loyalty program like eBay Bucks or Best Buy Reward Zone. Right. And that's going to take a year of testing. That's going to be really long. We're going to test some, maybe a media heavy up or different blendings of media. That's going to take really long. I like the team to have thought through why they think that will work. And then, so we don't have, I'm going to call it a wild card testing. We're solving problems, and we think we have enough information that this has at least a 50 to 60% chance of making it through.
Right. Well, I know you and I strongly believe in the value of testing. I know that when we both led marketing organizations, we put a lot of effort behind that. But I think it's really important to educate your management as to what the philosophy and expectations are behind that testing. Because if you don't do that, you're potentially going to come back and go, hey, guess what? 8 out of 10 of these fail. And they're going to think, what do we waste all that money for? And the whole point is, but the two that worked are going to be the things we can bet big time on. And one other thing I'm pretty confident you'll agree with is that even on the stuff that failed, you learn something. You learn something very valuable that you can apply to the next test. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I have this thing, before we do the test, we fill out the grid, because there's a lot of things you can't measure. But we fill out the grid. We don't put any numbers on it, but we put the measures we're going to care about. So that what I don't want to do is run the test and then decide on the measures, because then I think everyone will try and keep that test alive because they poured a bunch of emotion into it. No, we're going to put the measures, we're going to put the grid up, and then the numbers are going to populate as they populate. Right. And then if it is not working, in general, we're going to shoot that test. Because we do not want to lose our own objectivity rule. If there is some countervailing reason, we better be able to explain it to the marketing CFO in the way the marketing CFO says, yes, you should keep spending money because I think this is possible. And if we can't explain it to the marketing CFO who's living with us, the rest of the company is never going to accept it, and we will shoot it.
Right.
And so that's how I think about the testing, but I try not to let testing go to market if we have not decided on the grid. And then also, depending on what you're testing, you can share that grid and the objective with the company so they can ride along with you on it. That sometimes either things are so proprietary or so edgy, you don't want to share them with the company. But in general, I think it's mostly helpful if you can share it with the company saying, we're trying to solve this problem. We're going to test 10 things this year. Here they are. Here's the grids. We'll keep you posted as they come in. By the way, we only expect 2 or 3 of these to get out of it, but we're not testing them for this year. We're testing them for next year's plan.
Yeah, real life examples are always helpful for people to understand what you're talking about. One of my favorite ones that you've got is when you tested the loyalty program at Best Buy, and that was a bit of a roller coaster ride. I mean, ultimately the good guys won, but why don't you walk your listeners through what you experienced and what you learned from that?
So when I was at Best Buy, we were watching what I'm going to call, we were losing certain elements of our sales, like printer, ink, at the time, CDs and DVDs, to some of the big mass merchants. And we decided we would create the first loyalty program, I think in retail, and that was Best Buy Reward Zone. We tested this for a long time. And we built it as a defensive loyalty program, which was, we're going to reward you as fast as possible and give you a $5 coupon. And then you're going to come back, and that $5 would turn into at least $7.50 in sales. And you would come back, in our mind, more times. We didn't want to gum up any of the operations or any of the checkout or any of the actual redeeming components. So we tested it in Los Angeles just on music and movies for a couple of months till we were convinced it was going to work, and we had a trend line, and that it would not gum up any of the operations, that we could issue the coupons, they'd come in. At the time, we had our best guess that this would attach to maybe 10% of sales at the most. And we're going to turn this on for everything in the store. And not everybody was loving the idea. Some people in sales weren't that crazy about it. They weren't sure it was going to work. People were nervous about it. The trend line, though, was really good. We expanded this nationally. We made a big mistake. We did not predict the upside that this thing created. I got a call from the CIO, Mark Gordon, who had helped put this all together. He was in Boston at the time. He calls me up. He goes, Mike, we're running out of cards. This is day 2 of the national launch. And this has been a bitter fight to get it all the way through. He goes, we're running out of cards. I am air freighting these across the country to all the stores because we're running out of cards because it's attaching to 25% of sales. I think, my first thought is I'm an idiot for not ordering more cards because the carrying cost on cards is essentially 0. So that's job one. The second thing I do is I walk down to the CFO, Darren Jackson's office, and say, hey, you probably want to get me on audit committee because this is going to hit the balance sheet like a ton of bricks because these are all accrued liabilities and they're going to pay out longer, but the 60-day window is going to push them a little bit. Because Darren was, I think, a fantastic CFO and went on to be the CEO of another company. And he had been in this the whole time. He helped me get this through audit and hung with it. And then a year later, when we had actually run a giant paired test of people with the card and without the card, with the exact same purchase histories, we found that this was driving a tremendous amount of sales and profits, and we could actually share it with the street. But it was, yes, it was a good learning for me. And I didn't even think about the possibility of running out of cards, and we never stress tested the upside.
Yeah, I love that story for a couple of reasons. First, it shows the value of testing something and then, going for it. I mean, and if anything you learned, you need to look at both the upsides and the downsides as you're planning a rollout. But more important, I think it's a really good illustration of the value of trust between you and the CFO, because I think in too many instances, there is either a level of mistrust or there is just a disconnection between the CMO and the CFO. And the fact that you immediately knew that you needed to get proactive and get in front of this and have the CFO as your ally made all the difference between you being a hero and somebody starting to say, well, I'm not sure Mike is really the guy for this job.
To be clear, Kip, I was not a hero that first quarter. This thing showed up on the balance sheet because we had this argument when we were going through capital committee to expand it, where everyone's like, some people were saying, there's no way you're going to do 10% of sales. And the team is like, we're only promising 7. And if we don't do 7, we'll all quit, basically. And we're certain it's going to do at least 7. So we put it in, we got cards and everything for 10, we're ready. And then this thing just blew up. And, but we had studied the effect on the balance sheet and the liabilities this was going to build up. And
how long were you CMO at Best Buy, Mike?
Almost 8 years.
Okay, so I think it all worked out.
It all worked out, yes. And luckily, I had some wins under my belt by then. And also the CFO and I would do for a couple of years, we would do every quarter, we would do a discussion with the board of what's going on with the financials and what's going on in the marketplace. And I felt completely in lockstep with him. And I think he was obviously a great CFO.
Yeah. Well, Mike, I know we're starting to run out of time. Let's maybe do one other quick topic, and that's one that a number of CMOs can relate to, and that is, what if your numbers are going the wrong direction? And, you've got an unhappy CFO, you've got an unhappy board, and the CEO is starting to, drop some hints about, how long you've worked here and don't count today. So what's your advice when the numbers just aren't going your way from the marketing front? How should you manage that?
Well, at first, I think I always try and do what the company needs first. And sometimes the company needs you to help make the quarter.
Mm-hmm.
I also think sometimes, gosh, you're just going to have you're in a place where you may not win.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to recognize the difference between you're having a bad stretch and you may not win. Or they may need actually another player. And I think I try and be as crisp on the numbers part. I try and do what the company needs. And then I try and explain to the company, what's that going to cost them? Because usually it's sales overnight, brand over time. And the pressure is we need a lot more sales today, and we'll sacrifice the brand over time for that. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a totally reasonable thing for the company to do, but it has to know what it's giving up.
Right.
And I think my job is to tell them that. The other thing is, I don't know that there's really good advice for when it's going bad, other than you can be as transparent as possible. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that is really hard, because what that means is you may say, I'm going to cut a lot of the marketing money, and I think this is going to hurt us next year. And also, maybe you don't want to stay in that job for a whole bunch of reasons.
Yeah, Mike, I would agree. Transparency is important, but also, and you've illustrated this with your Best Buy example, being proactive. So in other words, don't wait for the CFO to come to you. I think you've got to be proactive in going to the CFO and saying, look, the way I'm reading the tea leaves, we are in trouble. And I know we're probably going to need to cut. And I've already started to think about some contingency plans. Because ideally, when you're in trouble, if you can go to the CEO as a partnership and say, okay, boss, here's the game plan, and we're united on this, that is going to go a heck of a lot better than, unfortunately, the way it does, where the CEO and the CFO kind of disappear in the back room and they come out and they have the tablets from Mount Sinai. They say, here's your new number. And you're going, wait a minute.
Well, I will say this is where the marketing CFO is really a helpful position.
Right.
Because one of the things that, at least in all my marketing CFOs, and I've always, that was a position I put it in at Best Buy, gosh, longer ago than I care to admit. And I've always had it. And we have a show on that where we're actually going to talk to a marketing CFO coming up. Where the marketing CFO is really at every staff meeting, we are going over the financials and the financial trend lines. Mm-hmm. So, and we're looking out at least, a current +6 a month. That would be, we're looking at the current math and then what 6 month out looks like. So we're not shocked if things are going sideways.
Right.
And then we are also having a discussion with the marketing CFO about, hey, what might go sideways on the financial front that we should be watching? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times there isn't that much. And sometimes there's an awful lot, depending on what you're in. Retail sales for holiday can be an awful lot of your year. Mm-hmm. And figuring out how the marketplace is and where you're going to go. And that's where the marketing CFO to me has been instrumental at keeping the team from being surprised by those tablets from, on high.
Yeah. Hey, Mike, one last question for you, and then I know we'll have to wrap it up. So I've been in situations, I'm sure you have too, where your board wants to be extremely helpful to the marketing, leader and give them all kind of help on what they should and should not be doing. So again, I'm sure a lot of your listeners are facing that situation, or they're going to face it. So how do you manage a board when it comes to, the financials and the marketing spend, especially if the numbers are heading south?
So I do a couple things. One, I will listen to everybody, but I'm not turning over my decision rights, surely not to the board and surely not to my peer group. I, though, will present always to the board and to the peer group what I call a marketplace scorecard versus a marketing scorecard. And that to me is our translation layer, which is, look, we're going to talk about sales, total ROI on marketing, market share, ideally if we have it profit or margin, and then retention, because I think retention is a super important thing for everybody looking at, especially if you're in a high acquisition cost business. We'll try and talk that way. And then if we are losing particularly market share or sales or profit, we'll try and understand why that is happening versus to be talking about, oh my gosh, we got to fix CAC or whatever. We got to get more efficient, because often when you're losing, it's not efficiency that's driving the losing. It's a marketplace problem. Mm-hmm. I'll try and have the discussion about the marketplace problem. And that is, I think, your challenge as a CMO and a lead team is to see the marketplace problem clearly and not think it is just the easiest thing you can see. And an example of that is a lot of people think, our price is too high, we'll just drop the price, everything will be fixed. Mm-hmm. Maybe not. And if you're wrong, you're degrading margin at speed. Or we just need to do more performance marketing. Maybe, but maybe those customers aren't available. And I think you have to understand the why before you do the what. And a lot of times, and my whole goal is to prevent the company and the board from immediately going to, what are we going to do to fix this problem, to why does this problem exist?
Right.
And if we can agree on it, then we can debate issues. A lot of times that's way easier said than done, but that's what I try and do. And sometimes it works.
Yeah, and one other thing to appreciate is that the CEO is in a really tough spot because the board is his or her boss.
Yeah.
And it's a real test of the partnership that the CMO has with the CEO when you're under that kind of pressure, because the CEO at some point can decide to switch teams. And ideally, you don't want to have that happen in the middle of a board meeting. I've seen that happen. So.
Well, and one of the easiest things, as we know, to think you're going to fix the problem is to just say, change the marketing and tell consumers to buy more stuff or to pay more. Right. And if only it were that easy, but a lot of times that's the easiest default for an awful lot of situations.
Yeah, I agree.
So, Gus, I think, Kip, we're out of time. Thank you, Kip. for being an MC, and thanks everyone for listening to CMO Confidential. Look for more of our shows on Spotify, SoundCloud, YouTube, and Apple. And this includes What Venture Capital Really Thinks About Marketing. You can listen to one of Kip's earlier shows, which is Why the Short Shelf Life of CMOs, Part 1, and we have Part 2 coming up as well. And then is the CMO position headed for extinction? So thank you, Kip. And hey, all you marketers, be safe out there. This is Mike Linton signing off for CMO Confidential.
This episode of CMO Confidential is produced and sponsored by AdCom, one of the premier integrated marketing and advertising agencies. AdCom works with mid-market companies to create measurable returns. With 30-plus years experience, AdCom partners to lead innovative strategy, creative, media, and analytics for growth-oriented brands that want to differentiate themselves in a crowded field. Working in B2B, B2C, healthcare, financial services, transportation, building products, and consumer goods, AdCom leverages unique internal and external insights to create dynamic and lasting brands ready to maximize their market position. For more information, visit us at engageadcom.com.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I want to tell you about my podcast called Can I Offer You Some Feedback? I'm a business consultant and executive coach with over 20 years experience in change management, leadership development, and naturally providing feedback to high performers. My podcast is for those of you who have a complicated relationship with feedback, whether giving, receiving, avoiding, or seeking. Feedback is essential for our development. In each episode, you'll hear from real people across industries with their ideas, perspectives, and best practices on feedback. I'll also be sharing business bites with you, simple explanations of organizational tools, management techniques, and leadership philosophies that will help you and your businesses thrive. You can listen to Can I Offer You Some Feedback on your favorite podcast app, or learn more at evergreenpodcasts.com.
Great careers are forged out of great relationships. Your success, whatever your field, relies and thrives on the support and insights of others. I'm Andy Lapata, an author and speaker on the power of professional relationships. In the Connected Leadership podcast, I have the privilege of interviewing people from around the world to understand the relationships that have made a difference on their journey and how their insights can help you. From Nobel Prize winners to Olympians, from NASA astronauts to peace campaigners, my guests have shared some captivating moments from their lives and careers. Combined with experts from leading universities, cutting-edge authors and giants of business, the Connected Leadership podcast aims to inspire, educate and entertain.